Hi everybody, I'm Molly McLeod. I'm the Restorative Practice Service Lead at Gloucestershire County Council.
Good morning everybody, I'm Kevin Day, Head Teacher at Belmont Special School.
My name is Charles Welsh. I'm Executive Head of Gardens Lane and Oakwood Federation Schools and Children's Centres.
I'm Gail Fletcher, Head Teacher at Gloucestershire Primary School in Cheltenham.
I'm Rachel Biddle, Inclusion Manager at St Gregory's in Cheltenham.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So we're just going to have a bit of a conversation today around restorative practice in Gloucestershire, what we're doing, what it is and what your experience is. So Kevin, do you want to start? What does restorative practice mean to you?
I think at the moment at Belmont, restorative practice means a new way of thinking, and I think we started down this journey because of a much bigger probably issue in society really, where we were seeing that our children weren't able to resolve relationships at home, resolve relationships in school, and it was such an issue for us that we wanted to think differently. We linked with Molly and the team, and the more that we've learned about restorative relationships and restorative practice, the more we've started to embed it in our culture, and the more we're seeing our children, even our children with learning difficulties, understand about the importance of relationships and respecting their peers, and understanding fundamentally that we have to resolve problems properly before just moving on. And that's where a traditional sanction wasn't working for our school. It wasn't working for the long-term benefit of the relationships with our children, and that's fundamentally why we decided to go down that road.
Can I pick that up, Kevin? Can I pick that up? Because we've just started on the restorative practice part. We did do quite a lot of work 10 years ago on restorative justice, and there's a legacy there.
Yeah.
But really, from our point of view, and you talked about relationships, what strikes me about this whole programme is future-proofing. It's looking at how the youngsters can learn from now, and as adults, take that social capital, those skills, and actually construct a more reflective lifestyle. And as things move forward, so from our point of view, as relative new players on this, it's that looking to the future, because we spend too much time looking at the past to punish and retribution, and it hasn't really developed anything.
It's definitely about giving them life skills and skills that they can take into the relationships outside of school as well as within school, and it builds that community within school, but also the community cohesion for their families and others in the area.
My knowledge and understanding of restorative practice is growing and growing. In its most simplest form, for us it's about how you go about repairing that harm when it's been caused, and also about how we're focused on restoring those relationships. So, and as for our school as a whole, our thinking around this is there is a better way. This is the moral and ethical thing to do, because it is future-proofing their lifestyles. And I've heard it being spoken about in such as, we teach reading. We teach children how to read, and if they have a problem with reading, we go back and we put intervention into there and we help them with that process. But there hasn't been that process in terms of behaviour in schools. And I think this, for us, restorative practice sits under that umbrella of nurturing, building and maintaining relationships. And restorative practice, that repairing of relationships, builds into all of that as well. Because you can't go through restorative practice and repairing relationships without touching upon how you nurture, build and maintain. So it's all encompassing.
I think that's a really important point, because what we're asking us as professionals and organisations is to model something and stick behind those principles. And as such, it has to be the whole school, or the community, you mentioned community, Molly, the whole part. How do we get that across so it's inclusive in its outset, but knowing that you have to have conscious thought about how you're going to behave, and conscious thought about how you're going to deal with something. Because a lot of the conflicts we have are reactive, and we're slowing people down to stop to be reactive and be proactive is part of that growing up and taking social responsibility properly and transferring that into other parts of the learning experience, be that in school or be that in the workplace.
And I think that's a really important point, because restorative practice is absolutely a way to be. It's not a thing to do. It's not something that you add on to everything else that you're doing. And it's about everybody being able to role model it, and everybody being able to challenge everybody else in a safe way, in a supportive way, so that we're understanding our needs as adults as much as we're understanding the needs of the children. And the children, for us, that we are human beings first, not professionals, you know, that we connect on a different level.
But again, I think that's a really important point, Molly, because what you're saying is the thing which some of the challenges is we're saying to our staff and ourselves, be self-reflective, be self-critical, and be honest with yourself, and recognise power imbalances when you're dealing with people, and how you overcome that so you have that equity in that equality relationship.
But that's hard, isn't it?
Yes.
When actually, as teachers, we aren't trained that way, and we haven't been practicing that way for a long time. And certainly, I would say one of our challenges is the system and the structure of the school day even doesn't allow for that time, for those relationships to flourish, for that reparation to happen. And so we need to rethink a lot about the way that we are teaching, ultimately, for the 21st century.
But this is the next step of society, isn't it? This is, if we think about how much we value children's voices in the 70s and the 80s, you know, if a child disclosed something about a teacher many, many generations ago, they'd probably be ignored. And now we would just find that absolutely outrageous. And I think this is just another step in that evolution of relationships and listening and being respectful, and that everybody's voice is as important as everybody else's. And I know from a staff perspective, we found it really challenging and rewarding. You know, even only a year down the line, you know, circle time for staff to reflect and share views. We've had some what from externally you might perceive as junior staff, like learning support workers, for example, having a voice and saying, I feel uncomfortable about this, or I don't think this is the right way for the school to go, or are we thinking about Nathan's views in this process? And it's been brilliant. They've been empowered to speak, and also I think my staff are feeling braver about bringing their own challenges into life. You know, they're able to say, you know, this has happened at home with my son today, or me and my wife are going through a bad time. So we're able to bear that in mind and be less judgmental if something significant happens in school, and if we can then see that somebody needs time out, and we can swap a teacher in and we can work with them. And I think the staff team are coming together and being stronger to support the young children. It's good.
We knew that to start our restorative practice journey, we had to start with the staff and build those staff relationships. So that's what we're working on. So we're embedding that through staff meetings. We're having check-ins and check-outs, and it's just a chance to sit together and share something that you have in common to build those relationships, because they are important. We see restorative practice as the mastery of relationships, and it's giving children those skills to take forward when they become adults, to then pass on to their children, and to give them responsibility over their own actions. Something that some people find a little bit difficult is understanding that all parties involved in the conflict have needs. So even the person who's caused the harm, they also have needs as well. So I think that's been a bit of a culture change for us, where we're not placing blame, it's listening to everybody's story and realising that they're communicating a need, and we need to look into that further.
One of the things that schools who are a little bit further down the line finding now is that actually their relationship with parents is very different, because the parents initially aren't necessarily understanding restorative practice, and they do still want to see those traditional sanctions or the consequences for that behaviour. And it's getting them on board that has had a really, really big impact for those schools that are kind of 3-4 years into their journey, that's changed the whole culture in their community. The way that parents talk to each other in the playground, the way that they're engaged in school, the way that they talk to their children in the morning, which means that their children are better behaved. You know, it just has such a huge knock-on effect on all relationships. It's
Picking those 2 points together, that it's the use of language and how we label things or not. And traditionally people are looking forward punishment, retribution. They want to see some action, something done. What you're talking about, Rachel, is actually how do we actually develop something at a learning point, both for the victim and somebody who's caused the harm. So we group that together. That takes time to embed in the culture, and the point with the community is you'll have a much wider spread of views, and you don't have at this stage that ongoing community set of vocabulary to enhance that. And in some ways, our own national government has a part to play here, because we're very keen to look at law and order, which often means crime and punishment. And there's the agendas about locking up or punishing for longer periods of time. Restorative practice is actually about repairing that damage, so that both people involved, or those involved, can actually move forward in a confident and just way, so they can take responsibility for what they did, but it's not there to be a mill around the neck for the next 20 years. You have to move away from having to capitalise people in punishment and lock them away. So you must stay there, because time moves on.
I know at Belmont we have had in the past some of those parents, and they'd even used the expression, "Are you as head teacher going to teach him a lesson?" Meaning, what is the sanction? And of course, the lesson is, if the lesson is, Jonathan's been isolated for 2 weeks, and then he'll be back in the same playground as your son, and he'll be back in the same classrooms as your son, and then the problems will implode again. Well, the lesson hasn't helped anybody, has it?
Lesson.
But if we can help those two young people resolve their differences, understand the needs of both of them, look at what happened, work it through, we help somebody learn from a poor choice, and we help somebody hopefully be more resilient and have confidence in the adults and other children around them to be brave and speak out. So I think we're also seeing some of our quieter pupils have more of a voice and have confidence in the adults and children around them, which is very good.
So we've talked about the benefits of restorative practice. What would you say are some of the challenges of implementing the approach?
I'm talking about challenges. I think we need to start with, even though we know we're going to face challenges, I feel that through even just the limited training that we've been doing in the very beginnings of this journey, that we are on the cusp of something which is going to be absolutely transformational. And there's got to be a real shift in mindset, and that's going to take time. And I think we've got to have that air of understanding that behaviours are a way of communication, which is what you touched upon as well. I think some of the challenges that we're just starting to recognise at the moment when you're speaking to staff is time. Is having the time to have these conversations, but then there's got to be that understanding that they will take time, but in the future we are going to reap the benefits of this, and it is going to be successful. I think some of the challenges as well that we might face is getting all parents on board with this. How do we do that? How do we sell this in a really positive way?
I think for me that's where the support networks for the school come into play, don't they? And I think that's one of the things that we need to start to look at is, how are you as a school being supported by your community professionals, your health workers, your family support workers, your early help, your social care, all of those kinds of people? How do they support what you're trying to do? Because if you're trying to keep a child in school that's not learning for whatever reason, most of the time it's going to be affecting relationships outside of school as well as inside of school. And so it's about, how do we bring those people in to support restorative practice and your journey that you're on as a school, in order to be able to keep that child in school and learning.
In terms of the wider community, what they will look at is word of mouth. And there's nothing more powerful in the playground than seeing success and saying, well, school dealt with this and they said this was the outcome. Actually, I'm pleased with that. The more of those conversations you get, the quicker and more sustained the change in culture becomes. So we have to have that dialogue and be prepared to say, this is what we've done, this is what the outcome, and we're pleased with it. And go back to your point, Gail, have the confidence to celebrate it.
Talking about that culture shift, restorative practice not being something that you do, it is just something that is always there. So one thing that we're looking at the moment, which will be a challenge, is changing the behaviour policy and not calling it a behaviour policy and not having it written as a behaviour policy, but as a relationships policy. Now, to some parents and to some staff, that is a huge step, and it's quite daunting to not have that backup of, this is the behaviour, what do I do? So we're looking into how we will write that relationship policy to suit the children and suit our school, but so that we're living out the restorative practice principles and not just saying and putting it on the website, this is what we do, but that we're actually doing it. I think that's really important, but that is a challenge.
And it's the sense of parents that schools have still got their rules in place, so there is still a sense of authority that we're not relinquishing all of that. I think that's what sometimes parents are worried about. But I think just in our early stages, the children who are going through this process are realising that once they get to the end of the restorative inquiry, that they're taking ownership of making amends and problem solving, and that process of making amends is not seen as a consequence. But it's relaying to parents that is a big achievement for them.
It is a huge achievement, and actually it's a very difficult thing to do. I think, one of the misnomers of restorative practice is that it's a soft option or it's pink and fluffy, and actually to go through the process where you have to acknowledge what happened, acknowledge how it impacted on you, hear how your behaviour impacted on somebody else, and then look at how you repair that relationship. That's a very difficult process to go through emotionally, and what you get at the end of it is very strong, and it is very healing and cathartic, and it's wonderful to watch it happen and play out in reality. But we can't get away from the fact that actually it's a difficult process to go through, and actually for some children and adults there might need to be a lot of preparation that's done before you bring those two people together.
I think Molly, what you're saying there is you're moving away from behaviour management to behaviour development, and that development will be at different stage for different people, and some in our community face massively difficult challenges, which I would not like to be in that position. I couldn't say how I'd react to it. But given those challenges, we have to give the infrastructure around about them to support that. But it brings it back to the point you made earlier on about where our other services sit, our community service, our health service, our youth services. What are we doing with those? Because it has to be a collective approach.
Absolutely. And I think to pick up on your point, Rachel, about it being about relationships and behaviour and how the parents might view that or the adults might view that, is we are shifting, aren't we? Like you're talking about behaviour development, we're looking at behaviour as unmet need. So actually, when we're having those conversations with parents, it's about what do you need in order to be able to understand this process and why what's happened has happened. Because quite often, the children involved in conflict have resolved it through the process. It's the parents or the staff or the adults around them that can't understand that actually no punishment was put in place, therefore it can't be better. But for the children, they've resolved it themselves. Their needs have then met. It's the needs of the adults that haven't been met.
And they're good at doing that, aren't they? I mean, scenario incident was a child came in to see me, and she said, I've done something wrong. I know what I've done. I know what I need to do. I'm going to go out. I'm going to have a conversation with them. I'm going to play with them for an extra 10 minutes. They were doing the restorative themselves already. And that's beautiful to see and a success to see.
Giving them the opportunities to do that though, and I think that comes back to this challenge of time, doesn't it? And actually how we set up our school day, how we set up, if you're a teacher and you're teaching 5 lessons a day, 5 days a week, where do you find the time to have these conversations? One of the aspects of restorative practice is if you're the person who's been harmed or you're the person in conflict, you're the person that needs to be part of the solution, part of the reparation. So how do we start to think differently to support our teachers to have those conversations, to repair those relationships so that when that child comes back into their classroom, they're able to start again?
Yeah, and I think on that front, picking up on what Charles said earlier, this is almost an invest to save, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we are targeting our, in my school, our youngest children as well as our oldest children, and we are investing in them and their families and my staff team to bring those skills on board. Because the traditional sanctions is very that's very staff intensive as well. Sitting with children in detentions, phoning parents about detentions, or writing letters about detentions. It's all man hours that are wasted. When actually, if we can upskill the children children to have discussions on their own. And I think what you said, Gail, that's the end victory, isn't it? When young people themselves facilitate a discussion, sit down, and we maybe have older children in our schools as facilitators of restorative discussions.
We are in an environment which is time impoverished. We don't have a lot of time. That's why it's important that we look at this as a whole school, that whoever comes across that incident deals with it, rather than having a hierarchical approach to it.
Absolutely.
It goes up a chain, comes back down a chain. This is a flat line here that says it's normal behaviour, that whoever's in that position deals with it, and they deal with it in this manner. So how I deal with it would be the same as Rachel deals with it, the same as Molly or Kevin or Gail. That creates a consistency, which goes back to your point about growing from the early years upwards, that consistent model of interaction and self-reflecting on relationships and behaviours becomes part and parcel of the DNA of that institution.
I think linking in with that consistency, it's important for all children, but particularly children with additional needs. On a day-to-day basis, children come into contact with so many different adults working in the school, you know, office staff, midday supervisors, teaching partners, lots of different people. And if they know that a certain way of the way they behave will be managed the same way by everybody, it sets really clear boundaries and expectations, and there's none of that, well, in this person's classroom this is acceptable, or you know, or they'll speak to me in this way. If by following the inquiry cards, it gives the adults the confidence to speak to those children, and it's consistent every time an adult does speak to that child.
It's
they
a
know
safe
what to
space,
expect.
isn't it?
And children love fairness and justice, don't
Yeah.
they? They absolutely do. And they're very good at saying when something's not fair.
Yeah.
They're very good at saying, but that's not okay. And so actually what we're doing is we've got language that we're using in order to go through, well, what does need to be put in place then for it to be fair and for it to be just and for it to be better.
And I find as soon as you start asking the questions, the child knows exactly what's going on, and they're sort of ready then to, you know, have that conversation with you, because it's like, okay, this is going to help me, so I'm happy to answer your questions, and then you can gather all of your information and then, you know, be a facilitator to help them repair whatever has
But
happened.
if we break it right the way down to an individual child that's had some behavioural challenges, traditionally, in my experience, those young people have been anxious about a sanction. In some cases, they therefore haven't been honest, because they have been conditioned to, if I get caught, I'll get in trouble, mum won't be happy, I'll get a telling off from the head teacher. So they've lied and made poor choices, which has made it harder to resolve. And often in schools, we don't get to resolve it if it's two children on the playground and it wasn't witnessed by a staff member. But being more restorative, being more reflective, moving away from sanctions, in my experience, those young people now are actually confident to say, I have done wrong. And they are learning about the implications for others. They're able to be honest because they know they're not going to be sent home, or mum and dad won't shout at them, and actually it helps a relationship. So it's helping resolve pastoral issues a lot quicker than traditional investigations.
I find that sometimes the children don't even need to get to the point where they're admitting they've done something wrong. This is what happened from my point of view, and because that's just accepted and that somebody else's truth is different, that's okay. We're not too worried about who did what happened. It's just how are we going to move forward, and what do you need to repair it. And I think that's really powerful, because the children are more likely to be honest with their version of events, but it's also not putting blame on anybody. By asking those questions, you're not saying, oh, so you did the wrong and you were harmed, and it doesn't matter.
It is a really important point to make, that actually restorative practice inquiry is non-confrontational language. You know, there's a reason that we don't use the word why, and we don't blame children, and we don't look at, like you say, the harm only sitting with one person. There is an acknowledgement that everybody involved in conflict has been harmed, and it's about how we meet both needs, and meeting the needs of both of those children, or the adult and the child, or the adult and the adult, might well be different for both of those people, but it's absolutely looking at what do those two people need in order to make it better.
I've been surprised with how well the children are engaged in the restorative practice inquiry and conversations. I know in schools, and I know we discussed this before, that you're always going to get extreme cases where it is going to be more difficult and there's a lot more work that needs to be done in order to get them to that point of speaking together. But what I've been seeing is the vast majority of children want to be engaged in this. They want to tell their story and they do want to resolve the situation.
Just to think, which I absolutely echo, that the children do want to tell the story because they want to be recognised as emotionally mature. And that's what we're asking them to do, to grow up emotionally, be emotionally literate.
And the longer I go through this journey, the more I've changed as a person, because this is changing my relationships personally as well as professionally. I interact with adults completely differently now, whether I'm at work or whether I'm at home. And I interact with my children differently. And it's benefited all of us. And I think it is that learning, like you say, a way of being, of how to role model what you want to see in others. But actually, in doing that, you have to reflect on what you want from yourself. And that's really important too.
And take responsibility for it.
Absolutely.